Good afternoon, colleagues in Prague and in the Czech Republic. It's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon for a discussion about the state and outlook of the European environment. And I would like to thank the colleagues at CENIA who have contributed to the report that I will be presenting, but also, of course, the Ministry and the Charles University for co-organizing this event. A lot of what Miroslav has already mentioned as a sort of global context, of course, will come back in the European context. So I will frame European responses, European data, European assessments in the context that he has put so eloquently on the table. And I know that this event is 3 hours straight, so that's a long attention span online, as we've learned over the last 10 months. So I will try to give my presentation and then allow for enough time for questions and interaction. And I'll try to do it in a way that keeps the audience as engaged as possible. Well, let me start by saying that the State and Outlook of the Environment report is the key report that brings together the knowledge of the European Environment Agency and its network in the countries every 5 years. Okay, so this is the 6th edition of the State and Outlook of the Environment report, which we've done together with our network. And a lot of countries in Europe, almost all of them, including, of course, the Czech Republic, are doing similar reports. And if you can see here that the Czech Republic was one of the early countries, especially if you would look at what some still call the newer member states, in creating its own tradition in producing these types of reports. So what we do at the European level is deeply embedded also in national dynamics. Now, I think it is important to say that the State and Outlook Report 2020 is not just a report. It's part of a process of strong political engagement. And I will come to the European Green Deal, and you can see here when we presented the report, there was a really strong collaboration with Executive Vice President Frans Timmermans and with Commissioner Sinkevičius, which it's also explicitly regarded as an instrument for policy support, and we have brought it to the key stakeholders in Europe. Because it's obvious that if we want to change from an unsustainable trajectory to a sustainable trajectory, we can not only do this with public actors, we will need to embed it in a societal dynamic. Now, of course, this State and Outlook of the Environment report landed in a particularly fruitful political period in Europe. And we all know about the Green Deal by now. And in fact, in the Commission document that put the Green Deal on the table, the State and Outlook of the Environment report is explicitly mentioned as a knowledge foundation for the Green Deal. And if I go through the ambitions of that Green Deal, becoming the first climate neutral continent, having a strong biodiversity strategy for 2030. In fact, the document talks about world leading, a new circular economy action plan that really goes into the sectors, a zero pollution strategy with serious impacts on the chemicals sector, a farm to fork strategy which links our food system to our health, and then social and economic dimensions with a just transition and an investment and an industrial strategy. And I think it's fair to say that this European Green Deal is by far the most ambitious, most forward-looking, most integrated agenda ever put on the table by the European institutions. And what it in fact does is to say that, of course, any policy package is about society and a functioning economy, but in the 21st century, we will have to organize this in a way that is responsive to the boundaries of the planet, to the limits of the ecosystems on which we depend for our European societies. Now, to go through the fundamental basic analysis that is done by scientific networks, I can refer to the global context. And we all know the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and its fundamental work and messaging on why we have to limit the average temperature increase on the planet. And of course, Miroslav has also referred to that. A second panel is probably a bit less known. It's the panel on biodiversity and ecosystems and ecosystem services, which in its report that is in preparation of the global summit in China on biodiversity next year, comes to the conclusion that we are living in a time that they call the sixth great extinction, about 1 million species that are threatened or extinct. And the question then becomes, will Homo sapiens as a species become part of that extinction wave? And a third panel that is even less known, I would say, is the International Resource Panel, which refers to one of the megatrends that Miroslav mentioned, and that speaks about our resource use, resource efficiency, the materials that we use, and how that is linked to impacts on environment and climate. And all of those reports come to the same sort of conclusion. We are living in times of urgency if we want to turn these things around, the negative trend lines. That means that we live in a pivotal decade. We are already dealing with irreversibilities in all three of them, which means that to a certain extent, we're already in the territory of damage control. It's not 5 till 12, it's 2 past 12. We are seeing tipping points, which means that the equilibrium between human existence and the planet has been disturbed, and we will go to a new equilibrium, and it will depend on our actions what type of equilibrium that is. And all of these are interconnected, which means that if we fail on biodiversity and nature protection, we will fail on climate and the other way around. Okay. A nice way to illustrate that with the global megatrend that Miroslav mentioned is this global map, where you see we're now at early 20th century. You see the temperature on the planet oscillate, colder, warmer. We're close to World War II now, where we are now, and it's still, the system is moving, and some climate skeptics say, see, this is it's a natural thing, it has always moved. But then we go into the 1970s, and Mao dies in China, and we start to see the onset of what we call globalization, with a massive increase in economic functioning and the impacts on the environment. And this is where we are today. Well, in 2017, it would look even redder today. So there is no more business as usual, which also means that we need to come with solutions that are not business as usual. That was the global setting. And now we go to the European analysis that we have made. Well, if you look at the European policies in the past period, they were captured in 3 essential categories. One was the protection of natural capital, ecosystems, biodiversity. The second bundling of policies was the move towards a more low carbon and resource efficient economy. And the third one was the link between human health and well-being and the environmental basis for that. Now it's clear that if you look at this picture, and we call that the piano of the European environment, every key on the piano represents a policy or a bundle of policies for which we have solid data that often comes from the member countries. And it's obvious that on natural capital, the most foundational capital on this planet, we have an issue. There is a little green and there is quite a bit of red and yellow. Now, when we look at the future, it is obvious that the green disappears. And a lot of the green disappears all over. Now, does that mean that we are losing faith in European policies per se? No, but it means that some of these megatrends that Miroslav was also mentioning, the driving forces behind pressures on climate, on the environment, on biodiversity, on our human health, are structurally so strong that if we don't address the fundamental drivers, but only try to fix the consequences, we will not get there. Now, the good thing about looking forward is that the future doesn't have to look this way if we really implement a different type of policies, the type of policies that are deeply embedded in the European Green Deal. Let's look at this in a bit more detail. If we look at natural capital, we see that also in Europe, we are losing biodiversity, and there is a linkage with climate change. And if we look at the keys on that piano, but then in this way. We see past trends over the last 10 to 15 years where we're only in the green, where we are actually protecting areas, delineating areas that we call protected. If we look at the impacts on biodiversity and ecosystems, whether it is wetlands or hydromorphological pressures or marine ecosystems, then the trend lines are not very positive. And if we look at 2020 objectives in policies in Europe, we're not reaching the objective. So that leads us to say that there is a really serious implementation gap. And that is a critical conclusion from the report. We have to continue to put pressure on our governments and our societies to fully implement the European policies that they agree to and put on the table. Now let's look at where we are in the green, the protected areas, and where the Czech Republic is compared to other countries in Europe. And you see, compared to other countries, the share of the country designated for protected areas is a bit below average in Europe, with some countries that have designated a lot of the territory and some countries that have designated a small portion of the country. Now, in the new biodiversity strategy, the average in Europe will move towards 30%, so we should see all of these numbers increase in the next years. If we look at the European level, at the decline of biodiversity, what is very obvious is that if you look at birds in decline, that you see overall a slow decline in all common birds here, a slow recovery of forest birds, but we see an overall decline in farmland birds, a decline of more than 30% over 2.5 decades, which makes the link to agricultural practices. And we see the same decline with butterflies, which are critical pollinators, and they are an indicator species for that. So here again, we can make a link with pesticides use and chemicals use in the agricultural sector and other sectors. Now, if we go from species to habitats, we see that it's only in the blue that they are in favorable condition, and we see a lot of yellow and red. So a lot of our European habitat types are actually not in good condition. We see the same in water bodies, where regardless of 2-3 decades of European policies there, a large number of water bodies are not in good ecological status. And in some areas, one could expect that. In other areas like Scandinavia, that is probably less expected by people. And of course, you can look at the color coding here for the Czech Republic and then look at your own national level what that means. And so water bodies are not in good shape from an ecological perspective. Now, if we look at land and soil, and I would say that's a bit of an underestimated issue, but our activities are by definition almost land-based for the most part. Europe does not have a strong land policy, and soil biodiversity is really under threat as well. And that is illustrated by the following graph, where we talk about land take, urban sprawl, land take for infrastructure, further landscape fragmentation, which is critical to protect biodiversity, and overall soil degradation and contamination, which is of course important for biodiversity, but also for the food system and agricultural production. So we see quite a bit of land take, and again, you can look at the area here and then translate that also into a national perspective. If we go to the second area on resource efficiency and low carbon, we see a bit of a better set of trends. We are moving slowly in towards a circular economy. We are indeed dealing with greenhouse gases in Europe since a couple of decades, so the trend lines are green. If we look towards 2030 and 2050, the color coding is red, which means that they are probably not in line, or certainly not in line today, with the objectives of, for example, the Paris Agreement or the objectives laid down in the Circular Economy policy package in Europe. So those are concerning trends. Let's now look a bit at some of the elements here. If you look at recycling rates, which is something that people often bring up when they want to discuss environmental policies, well, between 2004 and 2018, we see that the Czech Republic has increased recycling of municipal waste a lot. If you look at the two bars, there was a lot of improvement, but there is still quite a lot of distance to be covered to become one of the top countries in Europe when it comes to recycling. If we then overall look at waste generation in Europe, you can see that the GDP has grown more than waste generation, but waste generation grew more than average population. So we are creating per capita more waste in Europe. And what is I would say, more concerning is that we still look at that as waste primarily and not as materials that need to stay into the economy, which would be, of course, the objective of a circular economy logic. Then if we look at resource efficiency, which is much more fundamental in the end, you can look at resource efficiency of the economy, and here the Czech Republic is towards the lower end of resource efficiency in Europe. We do see a positive trend from year to year, 2000, 2008, 2017, but compared to many other countries, it's still rather low resource efficiency. So there is quite a bit of scope in the Czech Republic compared to other countries to make improvements there. I said already that we still look at waste as waste and not so much as materials, and that is reflected in the very slow increase of circularity of material use in Europe. So we have framed the circular economy over the last decade, but it now needs to speed up in its actual implications for how we keep materials and their value in the economic cycle. If I then look at climate change, and Miroslav has mentioned that extensively, we indeed see that most of the warmest years on record occurred in the last 2 decades, if not all of them. Yeah, so that's a trend line that we are responding to with policies. And Europe has, for a number of years, been at the forefront globally to frame strong climate policies. We are, I would say, the only region on the planet that has taken the Kyoto Protocol period seriously and that has stuck to its obligations. And that means that since 1990, the base year for greenhouse gas emission reduction comparisons, that Europe has decreased. By now, the latest numbers, we just came out with them yesterday, is that we're at minus 24%. For 2020, due to Corona measures, we expect an even deeper cut, yeah. And the economy grew over that same period by almost 60%. So it means that we can decouple energy use and greenhouse gas emissions from economic performance. And Europe is really the only region that has done this as a region. Now, Europe has as an ambition in the Green Deal that we will become the first climate neutral continent, which means that by 2050, we should have net zero emissions. So we should at least move the ambition level to this zone. And the blue zone is where we are currently with policies. Our trajectories are models based on what countries report in terms of policies and measures, and they all report that to our agency, is that we would be at minus 36% by 2030, potentially at minus 40% if we have good implementation and the announced additional measures would really work, and minus 45 if we push that to the limit. But that is not in line with net zero emissions. So the European Commission has put on the table an increase in ambition to minus 55%, and the European Parliament has made that minus 60%. Now that means that if we move in that direction, that we will have to focus on speeding up cutting greenhouse gas emissions. And if you look at greenhouse gas emissions over the last 3 decades, you can see that the Czech Republic is indeed one of the countries where greenhouse gas emissions have declined over that full period. And that, of course, has to do with leaving behind an old industrial past after 1990, but also recently of investing in modern technology. And you see where you are. I think the biggest challenge will be towards 2030 to stick to a continued pathway of cutting emissions when you don't have that big initial loop of moving out of an old industrial paradigm. This is also needed. We have good reason in Europe to do this, because if you look at precipitation predictions on an annual basis, you see that the region where you are, together with most of North and Northeastern Europe, will see significantly more annual precipitation, but not during the summer months. So it will fall during winter, fall, and early spring, with a lot higher probability of floods, which are very damaging to the economy and are often not well insured. So we have good reasons as Europe to really move into that direction. And if you look at summer precipitation in the Mediterranean region, we see declines of -30, 40, up to 50%, which would have a huge impact on the livability. So if Europe is ambitious, it is clear why that is needed also from a strictly European and not even global perspective. If I then move into the third area, which is health and well-being, you can look at where we have made improvements, and that is in concentrations of air pollutants and air pollution impacts on health and well-being, but I'll come to that. Yeah, the trends are positive, although we are not really reaching our policy goals. We see quite a bit of impact from pollution in waterways, chemical pollution when it comes to human health, and increasingly we make the link with climate change and human health. If you look at reaching objectives by 2020, this is not the picture that we want to present to European citizens. Now let's look at some positive evolutions. The air pollution in general is decreasing in Europe, but if you look at ozone and fine particulate matter, PM2.5, we still have more than 80% of the urban population in Europe, and that is most of the European citizens, are still exposed to pollutant concentrations that are well above World Health Organization air quality guidelines. Now, Europe has made a commitment very recently with the launch of the air quality report a couple of weeks ago. The Commissioner has announced that there is a clear willingness to move the policies in the direction of the World Health Organization, simply because it is not acceptable that more than 400,000 European citizens die prematurely because of bad air quality. We need to cut this down. This will be a challenge also for the Czech Republic, because if you look at PM2.5 concentrations in EEA countries, you see where the Czech Republic is. This is the EU limit, but it's well above, the measurements are well above the World Health Organization limit. So this is really a challenge that we see in many countries in Europe. Most of them are above the World Health Organization limits, but it's a particular concern in a number of countries, primarily in Eastern and Southeastern Europe. And of course, we make a link with human health. If you look at life years lost per 100,000 inhabitants, and we look here at quintiles, 20% intervals, it's obvious that there is an issue in Eastern and East Central Europe and Southeastern Europe, and this has to do with the energy system, coal-based. It has to do with mobility, where the cars tend to be older, but also with domestic heating, the use of wood-burning stoves, of coal in the households. So there is an issue there that requires specific attention, not only because of air quality and climate change per se, but because of the impact on human health. Another key element for human health towards the future is the risks of chemical pollution. Europe undoubtedly has the strongest system of chemical risk analysis and the reporting of that. And that is embedded in the REACH legislation, and most of that work is done by the Chemicals Agency in Helsinki. But the estimate is that there are about 100,000 chemicals on the market in Europe. And for most of those, we don't know the risk assessment. So there are 70,000 of those with poor characterizations for their hazard and exposure risks to human health, which sends the signal that we will never catch up if we continue to do this one chemical by chemical. So the new chemical strategy in Europe is focusing at the core principle of safe and sustainable by design, which is a massive shift in thinking about chemicals at the source, but also in grouping chemicals when it comes to risk assessment. And this will be very strongly debated on what it means for this also Industry 4.0 in terms of technological innovation at a very fundamental level. When we think of risks to health, an underestimated issue is noise pollution. And here we know that there are about 100 million European citizens that are exposed to noise levels that are above the World Health Organization standards. And that comes particularly from road noise and particularly in cities, of course, in urban areas. So this is an issue, again, that needs to be tackled because especially mental health issues, people's sleep that is disturbed are at stake, and that then has an impact on other conditions like heart disease, high blood pressure, and other issues. One of the more success stories in European policies is actually the rather sharp decline of industrial pollution of key pollutants. And we see a bit of a tapering off here, and that continues. But still, there is a very significant decline of 60, 70, up to 80%. And that is mainly due to European legislation, which was driving technological innovation. And this has had a good positive impact also on human health, but also on environmental and conditions and ecosystem qualities, although we still have quite a bit of terrain to cover there. So we have made an analysis of where the issues are. I've referred to drivers, the agricultural system, the energy system, the transport system. So how have we traditionally tried to deal with this? Well, the answer has been often environmental policy integration. And environmental policy integration means that we add environmental performance and environmental concerns to traditional sectoral policies or health policies. And often this has been rather in the margins. And the question then is has this delivered? Well, the picture is, to say the least, mixed. If we look at the transport sector, where we have had environmental concerns for a couple of decades, if you then look at the overall greenhouse gas emissions of that sector, well, first of all, it's the only big sector which has been adding greenhouse gas emissions since 1990 and not seen them decrease. And if you look at international aviation, you look at the overall transport sector, we've seen emissions indeed increase. So focusing on marginal efficiency gains and so-called integration when it comes, for example, at building more efficient cars or the engines of cars or cutting down on emissions left and right, this is counterbalanced by a much higher demand, by more kilometers per car that we drive at the European level, so that policy integration has not really delivered here. The same we see with policy integration in agriculture. And the previous CAPs, Common Agricultural Policies, have included more attention to environmental issues. But the overall pressure on ecosystems, and we use nitrogen inputs to agricultural land here as a proxy indicator, are what they are. And we see an increase there, that is very significant. And if you look at the red zones, and again, you can look at the area where you are at this moment, we see an increase there. So the greening of the cap has shown to be ineffective. And we can say that from a monitoring perspective. The Court of Auditors has just recently come to that conclusion based on how the money has been used, distributed, and then led to intended outcomes. But overall, pollution of soil, water, air, unsustainable agricultural practices, overexploitation of natural resources throughout the agricultural practices is still an issue, which is of course one of the reasons why many have been writing in a very critical way about the current cap proposal and the trajectory it has been on through the European Parliament. Let me give you one last example that is aligned with jumping to conclusions too quickly. 10, 15 years ago, there was a big push for biofuels. And we need to take a sharp look when we come to conclusions too quickly and privileged one technology or one solution. The trade-offs here are potentially very large. And so the real systemic question to ask is not, should we use biofuels? The real systemic question is it really the best use of agricultural land to grow crops, to make fuels, to put in a 19th century technology called a combustion engine that has an efficiency rate of 25% on a good day, to then travel distances in Europe that are on average below 10 kilometers? Is that really the best use? And is that really the best response we can think of when we want to move into a sustainable mobility system? So these examples illustrate that we are coming in the past often with recipes that have not touched the core elements of the system. And that's where we start to talk in the agency about sustainability transitions, which means that we will need fundamental systemic change in those systems that provide well-being for the economy and social cohesion in Europe, which is why in the Environment Agency, we have put the emphasis on the one hand on the food system, and I do not single out agriculture there. Agriculture is only one phase of the food system. And actually it's rather sad that this is singled out time and time again, because it blames the farmers for the externalities of our food system disproportionately. And it forgets that farmers are often stuck between a rock and a hard place. And the rock are the agrochemical input industries, and the hard place are the food industries, where actually farmers are fighting for a decent living and a decent income, and the value chain is not treated in the same way as they are often treated. So I'm a strong proponent with the agency to talk about the food system as a whole. Then there is the energy system, of course, which Miroslav has also talked about, the mobility system, which I think is critical, and then the built environment, where a lot of the materials that we use are also there. So we are looking now at the drivers, at the systems that are out there that will need to go through a transition. And that is where we are looking for interlinkages. We are also looking for policy frameworks that go to the core. And I think if you look at the European Green Deal, that is exactly the intention, to go to the core. People like Frans Timmermans also talk about systemic change very openly now, which 5 or 10 years ago was almost unheard of at that level of policy and politics in Europe. It also means that we need to reflect on policy gaps in our systemic approaches. And food was clearly a policy gap. So with the farm to fork strategy, Europe is now coming with a food policy and linking it essentially to human health. We also need to think of a land and a soil policy, which is largely not there in Europe. It failed on 2 occasions, because of some member states that wanted to block it. But it is essential if we want to go into a sustainable direction, and also a chemicals policy. The current chemicals regime is unadapted to zero pollution. It's unadapted to circular economy because we build up toxins in the recycling of materials, potentially. It's unadapted to a one planet, one health type thinking, and it's unadapted also to coming with solutions for climate change. So the chemicals policy that is now on the table is essential. And of course, we need to leverage the power of cities, businesses, and communities, because this is clearly not a policy that can only be done or an approach by public institutions and by political decision making. We also need to recognize that systemic change will be disruptive. I always say there is an intrinsic optimistic curve for this type of innovation, and that is one of experimentation, where new technologies appear, and we facilitate that through research and development programs, and that's where Europe is investing more money than on any other region. We facilitate the acceleration through pilot projects, through public procurement, or through creating innovative circumstances. And then we start to institutionalize it, and we come to a more stable situation. You could think that the type of policy that is calling for the rapid electrification of mobility in Europe would follow this trajectory. But at the same time, it means that we need to create space for a serious discussion on those practices that we need to phase out. And that means maybe breaking down some industries, which might be an exercise of destabilizing fixed regimes, for example, tax breaks or subsidy systems or habits of consumers. And we need to move away from the idea that we will get there by optimizing the technologies and the solutions that we have today. And the sooner we recognize this curve, the quicker we will create a space for the green curve to break through. And we should not be naive. This is where the conflicts will be. Yeah, if you think of coal mining regions in a country like Poland, but also in other countries in Eastern Europe, of course that is not an easy decision to make. Yeah? That is clear. Or if you think of people who make a living in industries that don't have a long-term sustainable future and that don't have the potential to shift towards more sustainable practices, this is not easy. Which is why we need to come with enabling conditions. We need to reconvert industries. We need to support regions that need to make that conversion. We need to think of societal embedding of opportunities to move into that 21st century economic functioning. And we need that because we need to speed up and scale up. Remember, I started out by framing a pivotal decade. Well, this is a response to a pivotal decade. It also means that we need to be much more serious about recognizing trade-offs. And if you take the sustainable development goals and you map them against each other, you see the more reddish and orangish areas, which is where they are conflicting. And in essence, it is where the natural capital objectives are conflicting with the production and consumption objectives. And this shows that we need to go through fundamental change in those systems of production and consumption. It also means that we have to think about where we are going to invest. And that is a really big and important debate. There is a high risk that we will keep investing in what are dead-end streets. Marginal efficiency gains in the technologies and the approaches that we know. And any engineer or economist will tell you that marginal efficiency gains are increasingly marginal by definition and also have a higher and higher cost. And they will not lead us to the breakthroughs that we need to go to, for example, net zero emissions. So they will lead to stranded assets and potentially also to stranded workers and stranded regions. And I don't think that that is what we want. So we need to go from a logic of high cost and dead-end streets to a logic of investing in the future. And if you look at European policies, the Sustainable Finance Initiative is clearly pointing in that direction with the green taxonomy. That is about investing in the future. The EU budget is increasingly in line with this reasoning. The new stimulus fund to grow out of the corona crisis, Next Generation Europe, is clearly putting the mark there. And most surprising to a lot of people is that the European Investment Bank is transforming itself to a bank for that type of investments. They are stepping out of all carbon-based or energy sources in a month. And the European Central Bank under Christine Lagarde is reinventing itself more and more, as she says, as a climate bank. So that is clear. We also need to think of the social vulnerability issue, of course, because we cannot bring this story and then leave behind large numbers of people. And in a report that we did, we looked at inequality in Europe, poverty rates, GDP per capita, and pollution. And you can see that low-income regions in Europe overlap with air pollution. So coming with a story that improves economic performance, that improves the capacities and the potential of people to be successful and productive and economically in a better place in Europe, together with better living conditions, I think is absolutely critical. To go to my final slide, I think it's clear from our report that the window to turn unsustainable practices around is closing. That's what science is telling us. And that may be an uncomfortable message, especially at times, and Miroslav mentioned, when science is often attacked, not necessarily everywhere. And I have to say the corona crisis has probably strengthened people's trust in experts again, at least on health issues. But in order to turn things around, we will need bold action, which means much better implementation, doing things better. But not only doing things better, doing things differently. Fundamental shifts in our systems towards sustainability and coming with, if needed, indeed disruptive policies. And that means we need to do the right investments, transformative investments that open pathways to the future and not costly marginal efficiency gain investments in dead-end streets. And on top of that, I think, and very importantly, we need to foster the type of innovation that can bring society into this discussion in its most productive, creative, and engaged way. We don't have to speak to society, we need to speak with society as policy makers, and we need to create an environment where the creative energy in that society is contributing to innovation. And that doesn't only mean technological innovation, but also societal innovation. And if we do that, I am sure that the promises of the Green Deal will lead to a much more livable, equitable Europe that can play a lead role globally in turning unsustainability challenges into sustainability opportunities. I will thank you for your attention and my slides here, and I'm of course open for any questions or criticism or arguments that you would have. Thank you very much.
Děkuji Hansovi Bruyninckxovi za skvělou prezentaci, za ukázání všech oblastí, které zpráva popisuje, a nejenom to, zaobírání se tou budoucností, která nás čeká i na základě Evropské zelené dohody. Já přistoupím hned k otázkám, aby jsme měli co největší prostor pro debatu, a otázky budu pokládat přímo v angličtině. So Hans, are global or European policies strict enough to be able to prevent the worst case scenarios?
That's of course an important question, and I'm an optimist. By nature, I've been working in this field for 30 years. If you're not an optimist, you don't last so long in this field. But at the same time, I'm also a realist, and we need to bend these trends. And to bend these trends, we need to take things very seriously and not only scale up solutions, but also speed up solutions. Now, the good news is that for most of these big areas, we know the solutions. The technologies are already there. And in many areas, we know that even better technologies are on the horizon. We know which practices in terms of, our habits as consumers or citizens we can change. We know what a good and sustainable mobility system looks like. we know how we can use materials in a different way. So that is a good starting point. And I think it's fair to say that the European Green Deal is the best shot that we have in Europe to indeed do what we have to do. Yeah. So pushing for these policies and for a good implementation, I think, is important. A second element of the question for me is, of course, Europe is by now 10% of the global population. So you could say, yeah, but if we solve these issues, what is it going to do globally? Well, first of all, we shouldn't underestimate that Europe's share of the economy is much larger, that Europe, through our systems of production and consumption, is linked to the global economy. So we have an impact on those value chains and material chains. We also have an impact on global diplomacy. Europe is regarded as a leader in this perspective. The European Green Deal is picked up in many of its components, for example, sustainable finance, by actors in Japan, in South Korea, in India, in China, in Canada, and who knows, in a short while also again in the United States. So we play a significant role in the global discussions around this. And you see a push very recently on the Paris Agreement commitments ahead of the Glasgow COP. You see a push on biodiversity commitments ahead of the Kunming COP for biodiversity next year in China. So while not being naive, I think that Europe has an important role to play internally. It will lead to a more livable, healthy, pleasant Europe for European citizens. It will lead to Europe taking the lead in the competitiveness of the future. This is the type of economy that we need for the future. And I think it means that as the largest trading bloc and as an important player in the global economy, we can have an impact on how things are turning around. Now, again, without being naive, we will be dealing with the consequences of climate change for centuries to come. We will be dealing with the biodiversity loss issues. So we will need to adapt. Adaptation will be part of our society for a long time to come. Yeah, that I think is important. Another element, if I may, is that the young generation is putting pressure on the system. The question to Miroslav about Fridays for Future, I would say yes, that has put pressure on the political system. That is obvious. It's often mentioned in political debates. Secondly, I think it's clear that we have a generation of young people that will become engineers and will become economists and bankers, and they have a different understanding of the context in which they will grow up. They will be the engineers that come with even better solutions than we have today. They will be the bankers, hopefully, that understand that making the right investments and not the wrong investments is actually a logic that will contribute to turning things around and will be better for investment. So I think that is clear. And to frame it in a very short way, I was asked by one of these youngsters once, Mr. Bruyninckx, when did you start negotiating climate change? And I had to say, well, in 1990, actually. And he said, yeah, and what is the result? I said, it's about 65% more greenhouse gas emissions. And this youngster looked at me and said, is that the best your generation could do? And I said, well, in our role and with our knowledge, we can explain it, yes, but Europe did better and it's very difficult and we had globalization and you can rationalize all of that. But this is a generation that is really asking these tough questions. So I think if you look at that context, we probably never had a better shot at finally turning some of these negative trends around than we have today. Sorry for the long answer, but I think it weaves in a number of elements that can reflect, creative thinking about this.
Thank you, Hans. Let's go to second question. Do you believe the Green Deal is applicable? And there is one specific angle. In the field of noise reduction, for example, there are plans for 30 to 50% reduction of annoyance.
Yeah, well, in general, I would say, yes, of course, we can apply and implement the Green Deal. And I can say from a more institutional perspective, when Europe comes with these proposals, they go through an extensive review called an impact assessment. So we use the best knowledge, the best science to look at whether this is possible from an economic and a societal perspective, what will be the impact on the economy, on jobs, on sectors. And we also, of course, look at what type of technologies are there, what their rolling out of those technologies and innovations could be, and what effects it could lead to, and also what type of policy measures would be best applied to go in that direction. So the answer there is yes. Will it always be easy? No. Will it require for the next decades fundamental changes in areas that we have avoided often in difficult discussions, like environmentally harmful subsidies, changing our tax systems to take this into account, the courage to come sometimes with messages to sectors that will be on that red curve? Yes, that is the case. But doing nothing is much worse. Yeah? The economic losses, the societal losses, the price of unsustainability will frankly become unbearable. If we go to a planet that is heating up, warming up 4 degrees, it's not going to be a pleasant planet to live on. So it's better to act now than to think that we can deal with consequences later, because that will be more expensive and probably undoable. And that is exactly the spirit of the Green Deal. What Europe is also providing more than before are tools, leverage points, like the sustainable investment strategy that actually shows where to invest, and that will facilitate, I hope, what the understanding of what we need to do. There was a specific question about noise. Noise is not an easy topic, but we know from comparisons between cities that especially the thinking about urban mobility is a critical element. And if we can go to a more sustainable urban mobility system, there are so many co-benefits. This is really win-win-win-win-win. Yeah, it's air pollution, it's noise pollution, it's more space for green and blue areas in the cities. It's dealing with urban heat effects when you think of summer heat waves. It's dealing with the space that we will need for climate adaptation. So there is a lot of potential in transforming our cities into more livable areas. And one of the elements will be a huge improvement in noise pollution in urban areas.
Thank you very much. Regarding transport, there is a question: are we ready to stop transport? Presuming maybe for solution of this systemic change, we need to stop the transport.
Of course, we will not stop transport. And I would like to reframe it. Of course, we don't want to stop mobility, because what is it? We want to be a mobile, modern society. Yeah. But the question is, what is then the future? And of course, the solution is not the radical measures of lockdown that we've seen under Corona. And we know that they deliver a lot of benefits. Noise pollution went down, air pollution went down. I mean, all of that was positive, but it's of course not the way to do it. Yeah? But we can learn from places that have moved toward much more sustainable solutions. And I can give the example of a city that I know very well, Brussels. I'm Belgian, but also the city where I work now, and that is Copenhagen. Both cities of about 1 million, capital cities. And in Copenhagen, 83% of all the mobility is done by walking, cycling, and public transportation, which is highly performant, very high quality, facilitated by technology, by good information to citizens. In Brussels, most of the mobility is individual cars. In Copenhagen, the little bit that is left with cars has a massive number of shared vehicles, compared to other cities. So we can move towards other mobility solutions where the real question is not, can I have my car and can I drive when and where I want? The real question becomes, can I go from A to B in the most convenient way without putting undue pressures on society? And I think if we start to think in that way, yes, we can solve. Also at a European level, there are a lot of airline flights for distances between 500 and 1,000 kilometers. Yeah? Can we not think of a much stronger rapid rail system for Europe? Yeah? And let's get the youngsters on board. I remember from when I was young, eons ago, that we bought these railroad tickets that would give us a month to travel through Europe. It was great fun. It was good to do. Can we not get the youngsters on board and say, look, you get 3 free tickets a year from the age of 18 to 23 or 24, and then you can visit your boyfriend or girlfriend that you got to know through Erasmus, and you can visit your friends everywhere. And let's come with a connecting, engaging, future-oriented solution to transport that is not based on individual car ownership, on a 19th century technology that puts undue pressures on nearly everything in environment and climate.
Next question. What do you think is the role of waste management in Green Deal fulfillment?
Well, first of all, I think waste management and waste legislation is a critical example of where we are still facing very big implementation gaps. Many countries are not living up to the obligations of the waste legislation in Europe. Yeah? And that is something that needs to be tackled. And that also goes into illegal waste dumping. I mean, this is really something that needs to be tackled. But that is waste. Yeah? I think the real challenge for the future will be to move away from the idea of waste and think of materials management, where what you are collecting is actually materials that we have to reuse and keep in the economy. And I think that is exactly where the circular economy idea and the circular economy action package is going. And that requires a very different approach to waste. So moving from waste to materials is an important step, but fundamental in many countries is dealing with the basics of waste management, sorting, collecting, and then doing something with it. So yes, this is important, and it's critical in the circular economy and materials thinking in Europe.
Thank you. Well, the next question, would you say that countries like China, India, USA are willing to actively cooperate with the EU on the environmental policy, reduction of pollution, and climate protection?
Well, you're throwing 3 countries in a bag in the question. I would say China has made a lot of improvements in the last years and has announced really breakthrough programs very recently. If you look at the climate objectives they've put on the table in preparation of the COP on climate, or you look at the biodiversity concrete actions that they've put on the table with massive reforestation programs, for example, it's clear that China wants to be in the lead also of this new economic model. Now, I say that without naivete. I know they are still investing quite a lot in coal, although they're rapidly moving out and shifting their energy investments away from that. I know that they are dealing with massive pollution, still also chemical pollution. So we should not be naive, but it's clear that they are shifting rapidly there. Also because they are extremely vulnerable to climate change, to loss of fertile topsoil, to biodiversity loss. So they are very, very vulnerable. India is another story. They still need to go through a rapid improvement of living conditions for a lot of the population. There are still large, very poor masses of people. Now, what they are noticing is that, for example, in the energy system, the market is starting to dictate the direction of investments. Renewable energies in India are by far the cheapest form of electricity generation. So they are also moving investments away from coal into renewables, and they're speeding up there. But there are serious issues also with the food system. So India is a partner, but it's not always the most obvious partner. Also because they have a high claim on we have very little historic responsibility, so we want to be compensated and supported. And that is part of the economic compensation dialogues in a lot of the international regimes. The US is, of course, a very different story, where we will now be going to a new government that hopefully is built on science and that doesn't believe that the responses are in deconstructing what used to be one of the strongest environment policies on the planet, the US policies. And so I have high hopes that they will reconnect to this agenda. In the Democratic Party, there is also talk about the Green Deal, and President-elect Biden has made it very clear that he wants to be a lead player again in global environment and climate issues. So I think that is clear. What Europe, I think, needs to reflect on is the role of Africa. It is the closest continent to Europe. It's a poor continent. It's a continent that will go through a rapid and is going through a rapid economic expansion. What type of expansion will it be, and how can we have a really strong Africa policy when it comes to a Green Deal agenda? And that is where in the Commission program there is an explicit discussion about an Africa agenda that is connected to the Green Deal.
Thank you very much, Hans. Now we don't have any more questions from the audience, but if I may, I would like to ask you, thank you for showing the disruptive curve, the X curve. Where are we standing, Hans, on that curve? Are we arriving to the conflict yet?
I think in some cases we are. And I think in a number of areas we see the breakthrough. It's clear that, for example, battery electric vehicles are all of a sudden speeding up in their sales. You see that in a number of European countries. The lead country is, of course, Norway, not an EU member, but closely following EU policies. There it's 50% of the new cars are battery electric or hybrid vehicles. Now you can say, yes, but they are extremely rich. But you see, as we've seen with PV panels, the prices of these cars dropped. So there you are clearly on the curve there. And what we also see is that as a consequence, you see in many cases that the traditional combustion engine cars are on that declining curve. And European car makers that were pushing back and holding back on stricter regulation are now speeding up the transition and speeding up the green curve while slowing down or moving out of the red curve. In the energy system, it's clear that decisions by countries to move out of coal altogether and speeding that up is clearly the red curve. When you think of mobility, cities, and there is an increased number of cities that are banning all sorts of cars and types of mobility out of city centers, they are clearly on that red curve. So I would say, yes, we start to see that. Also with public finance and subsidy systems that are moving out of unsustainable practices. So we see both of them, but there are a variety of realities in the systems and the subsystems. And we also see that the strength of some industrial sectors to slow down is larger in some areas. And we also see that some countries are not so easily convinced to slow down what should be slowed down and phased out. That's the red curve, and that they try to only focus on the green curve. And you need both if you really want to turn things around. But in the city where I grew up, Antwerp in Belgium, there is a wagon maker street. It's a street that stems from the 17th or 18th century. I can tell you there is not a single wagon maker in that street again anymore. But the economy didn't collapse. People still have a job and we're still mobile. So moving out of industries that belong to a previous era and into new solutions is part of an historic sort of set of dynamics which we call creative destruction. And I think that is where Europe is now at. And yes, we see conflicts. If you look at the discussions about where the money should go in coal mining regions, or where we are discussing about the car industry or the CAP, the food industry and the agricultural sector, that's clearly where we see some of the conflicts. But we need to deal with them. We need to put them in the middle of the table and look at them for real, because we are used to looking at environment and climate issues as externalities. We risk to look at societal impact now, social impacts, as the next externality. And that will be very unhelpful. We need to put it in the middle of the table and look at it from the start. That's what I think the real challenge is. And then we will come with solutions.
Next question concerns air quality. Is not the Green Deal unbalanced in disgrace of the air quality if there are the trade-offs between climate change mitigation and air pollution policies?
Well, it's clear where the air quality legislation is going. It will take the World Health Organization standards and move Europe gradually in that direction. I assume that one of the questions there is in countries where they are planning a rapid phase out of nuclear energy, and where to compensate that they would invest in gas fired power plants, that would lead to more air pollution and more impact on the environment. Yeah, that is a serious discussion. Well, we have done a study a couple of years ago based on hardcore data, sector or electricity sector by sector, subsector by sector, based on the data at the level of every single power plant and the investment cycle. And the risk is more economic. There will be stranded assets in the gas sector if people start to invest in that sector, as some are claiming today. So the real question is, how can we move an electricity system in its production, but also in its consumption, speeding up energy efficiency to avoid investing in stranded assets in gas, to avoid the potentially negative consequences on air quality and other elements of what is in the end a carbon-based energy source, natural gas. And can we not speed up the breakthrough of a performance system of renewable energy? And in a European setting, that will for some decades to come undoubtedly also include in a number of countries nuclear energy. But overall, nuclear is not regarded as the solution for the European energy system. That is clear from the European Commission's work, that is clear from research institutions, but also clear from the International Energy Agency in Paris.
Thank you very much, Hans. I'm afraid this was the last question. Thank you for thorough debate and discussion, and please stay with us.